From at least 1766 BCE to the 20th century of the Common Era, China was ruled by dynasties. A dynasty is a family that passes control from one generation to the next. A dynasty does not have to last for a long time. One Chinese dynasty lasted more than 800 years, while another lasted only 15 years. The ancient Chinese believed their ancestors in heaven had chosen their leaders. They called this the mandate of heaven. The Chinese people often rebelled against a weak leader if they believed he had lost the mandate of heaven.
The Xia would be conquered by the Shang. These extremely warlike people brought the Middle Kingdom fully into the Bronze Age and into history because they were the first to begin to widely use writing. They were known for their cruelty and incorporated vast amounts of slaves into their armies. They would be conquered by the Zhou Dynasty.
After the Shang Dynasty came the Zhou Dynasty, when the realm was ruled over by kings through a network of feudal states. This whole period can also be divided up into the Western Zhou and the Eastern Zhou period. The first part of the Zhou dynasty was fairly peaceful, but after 476 BC, we had what is called the Warring States period. 7 prominent states emerged, and there was huge rivalry between them. During this period, there were also a number of influential ancient Chinese thinkers, including Mencius and Confucius. Eventually, after hundreds of years of battles, the states of Qin and Shu rose above the other states, and in the end it was the state of Qin that took power and established China's first dynasty, the Qin Dynasty. The Qin Dynasty was ruled over by China's first emperor. He centralized the power of the state, created a system of laws, standardized units of weight and measurements across his territory, and he also standardized the writing system. They weren't quite the Chinese characters we know today, but they were related. The first emperor imposed heavy taxes and started a lot of construction projects, including the First Great Wall. He even ordered books that he didn't agree with to be burnt. The Qin dynasty was very short, and the first emperor died in 210 BC. He was buried in a vast tomb in what is now the city of Xi'an. He's famous for being buried with a huge army of 6,000 terracotta statues, the terracotta warriors, and a lot of treasure that he wanted to accompany him into the afterlife.
Following the death of Qin Shi Huang, the empire descended into revolt and chaos. The province of Han consolidated power and maintained the unified realm. The Han were contemporaries of the Roman Empire and would export massive amounts of silk over what would become known as the Silk Road. Because this was so profitable, they expanded the empire westwards to control the vital trade route. This is considered China's first golden age, and this period saw many famous generals and scientific advancement. The Han Empire eventually split in 3, with each partition having an emperor claiming legitimate succession from the Han. The Jin were descended from generals who usurped the imperial throne. They would unite China again, but their reigns were seldom peaceful and were marked with violence and disorganization, and devolved into local rule where 16 kingdoms warred against each other, with 2 emerging as longtime rivals in the period known as the Northern and Southern Dynasties. This period is often considered a dark age, and was dominated by warlords who raided the land and by barbarian incursions. The Syi Dynasty was a short-lived imperial dynasty in China of pivotal significance. The Sui unified northern and southern dynasties and reinstalled the rule of ethnic Han Chinese, and began a process of cultural integration of the barbarians that had migrated into China during the centuries of chaos.
And after a few years, the Tang Dynasty was established under the Emperor Li Yuan. who was also known as Gaozu. There were a lot of remnants of Sui and rebel armies that had to be defeated in order to consolidate the Tang Empire. The Tang Dynasty ruled China for about 3 centuries and is seen as a golden age in Chinese history. It had a very strong bureaucracy and system of institutions with a national entrance exam for the civil service. Chang'an, which is now the city of Xi'an, was established as the capital. There were a number of battles against barbarians and tribes. The empire became much bigger. Trade along the Silk Road expanded. The countryside was placed entirely under imperial control, but it was leased out to the people in something called the equal field system. It was a golden age for painting, high poetry, pottery and Buddhism, and a lot of foreign cultural elements were integrated into the state. The Tang Dynasty also saw a powerful woman ruler usurp the imperial throne, Empress Wu Zetian. In the middle of the Tang Dynasty there was a rebellion called the Anlu Shan Rebellion, which severely weakened the central power of the state. And on the borders of the Tang state there were also barbarian tribes which formed their own dynasties.
After putting down several rebellions, they were deposed and China once again entered a period of chaos.
In 960 AD there was another coup, and an emperor who became known as Taizu founded the Northern Song Dynasty, and he established a capital at Kaifeng. He managed to incorporate a lot of powerful generals into his empire by giving them military positions. There was once again a unification of most of the country, a strong bureaucracy and a civil service system, and the state started to emphasize Confucianism again. The Confucian classics were re-examined by a scholar called Zhu Xi, and Neo-Confucianism was born. Eventually the Jurchen tribes invaded the Song and put the capital under siege, and then the northern Song fell. The invasion didn't get as far as the south, and the southern Song was established, with its capital in Hangzhou. This was a time of great scholar officials, and fine poetry and paintings were produced. The southern Song became highly wealthy, and they expanded foreign trade. They built China's first real navy and developed improved gunpowder weapons. The Song were able to keep the Qin Dynasty at bay, but they couldn't stand an invasion by the Mongols.
When the Mongols invaded, and Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, would establish the Yyan Dynasty. For the first time, the entire Silk Road connecting China to Europe was ruled by one power, and the Yyan Dynasty saw a great period of diversity of culture and material goods flowing into China. This dynasty would be short-lived and was supplanted by the Ming Dynasty. This dynasty is seen as a prosperous time and a high point for art and literature.
The Qing Dynasty ruled China from 1644. China was again ruled by a foreign people, the Manchus, who were descendants from Jurchen tribes. Later, the Kangxi Emperor adopted the bureaucratic system, the civil service exam system, and the Confucianism from earlier dynasties. He expanded the borders of the empire and built up the power and confidence of the Qing state. Then, the Qing Dynasty was ruled by 2 powerful emperors, Yongzheng and Qianlong, and they continued military campaigns to expand the empire. But meanwhile, in the 1700s, European powers had been building up great maritime empires based on international trade, especially the Dutch and the British under the British East India Company. The Qianlong Emperor famously told a British trade envoy that his empire had no need for European goods. The British were importing silk, tea and ceramics from China, and they were exporting opium to China, mostly from India, where they were growing it. The Qing Dynasty banned opium because it's a very harmful drug in 1838, and a minister, Lin Zexu, dumped opium supplies into the sea. This outraged the British, and the British declared the Opium War, and the Chinese military was simply too weak to resist. So China was forced to open up 5 ports to international trade and give Hong Kong Island to Britain. And then there was a revolt against the Qing in 1851 by a man called Hong Xiuquan and his supporters. And this person thought he was a modern-day Jesus. but the Qing Dynasty managed to put down this rebellion. Then there was a Second Opium War in 1858, and in 1860 the British and French marched on Beijing and looted the old summer palace. The Qing attempted to go through a period of self-strengthening, and they did make some reforms to try and catch up with the Western powers. In 1897 and 98, Western countries took more territories in China, and then the British gained more of Hong Kong. A group of people called the Boxers rebelled against these losses of Chinese territory to Western powers and the recent rise of Christianity in China. These Boxers fought an army of 8 Western powers. They smashed European property and put foreign legations in Beijing under siege. But the Western powers sent in troops, and the Empress Dowager Cixi, who was nominally in power at the time, and the Emperor fled. So these events left the Qing Dynasty in crisis, and there were attempts at reforms, and a rising reformer, Sun Yat-sen, he focused on trying to find a solution to revive China. But after the Xinhai Revolution in China, the Republic of China was established under Sun Yat-sen, and then was ruled over by Yuan Shikai. But there was no strong government to rule over the country, so attempts to establish a parliament under the constitution failed, and China fell into the power of warlords. And during this period, the Nationalist Party was struggling to keep control of the country. The Communist Party was founded in 1920. So in 1925, Chiang Kai-shek, who is called Jiang Jieshi in Chinese, he became leader of the Nationalist Party, which was supposed to be in charge. And then in 1931, Japan invaded northeast China, the area called Manchuria. And in December 1936, the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party agreed to unite together to fight the Japanese. The Japanese stepped up their invasion of China in 1937, savaging the country and committing large-scale war crimes, including massacre and rape. You might have heard of the famous rape of Nanjing. In 1940 and 1941, the alliance between the Nationalists and the Communists really started to break down, and the two sides were already engaged in a full-scale civil war between the Nationalists and the Communists for control of the country. World War II ended in 1945, and the Communist Party had seized control of China and declared the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949. The Nationalists retreated with their troops to the island of Taiwan. And since 1949, the Communist Party has ruled China as an authoritarian one-party state. And Mao sought to make China into a socialist state using a modified Marxist-Leninist system. He carried out land reform, and during his Great Leap Forward campaign, he collectivized the country, which meant he put it under collective control, and he also called for industrialization of the country. Unfortunately though, during this industrialization, a large part of the agricultural labor force was taken away, which caused huge food shortages and famines. Historians estimate that these policies may have caused the deaths of more than 40 million people. During Mao's Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 76, Mao's regime purged a huge number of people who disagreed with his rule, and there was widespread chaos and looting by Mao's supporters, the Red Guards. The violence and chaos completely disrupted normal life in China. Although there's heavy criticism of Mao Zedong's policies, some argue that his regime was responsible for reducing the gap between the rich and the poor and for making people more equal. Mao also helped to turn China into an industrial power and developed his infrastructure. After Mao Zedong, there was a short power struggle, and China has been led since then by Deng Xiaoping, who reformed the country and opened up the economy to the outside world in the 1980s, and he begun China's meteoric economic growth. He was followed by Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping, who took over the top position in 2012.